Should you go to work for that company that just got acquired by a PE firm? We'll get to that question in a moment. Welcome back to Interview At, where our goal is to help you land your dream job. And there's two ways that I want to accomplish that. First, it's by providing you post-game analysis on interviews that I conduct with my clients as they are preparing for their loops for their next big role. Where else are you going to get a window into as real as it gets interview situations, questions and answers from a variety of roles and levels, but also get the feedback from somebody who's been an executive at Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle, and a variety of startups. But the other way is by answering the interesting questions that I'm getting from my clients that I think might be useful for you. And quite frankly, there's some that I see a lot and some that are just unique and maybe people are afraid to ask. For the question today, I'm going to be leveraging my years of experience working in private equity, both as a principal at a private equity fund, a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund, as well as running KOM Partners, my advisory firm, for the last 4 years, where I service exclusively private equity firms. I had a client with whom I was working who asked me a great question that I would imagine many of you would also like the answer. On the topic of questions about funded companies, whether it be venture capital or private equity, what questions do you have about going to work for a funded company, but were either afraid to ask or didn't know how to ask in an interview? Leave a comment below and I'll be sure to get to them. The specific question I was asked about was about whether or not it was common for PE firms to reinvest in a company that they had already sold once. So what happened here is a PE firm bought a company, held onto it for a little while, sold it to another PE firm, and then 3 or 5 years later came back in and bought that asset back. And this client of mine was going to go work at the company that was now being reacquired by the PE firm, was concerned that the same private equity investor was coming back into the deal. There's many reasons for the sale of a business by a private equity firm. First, just a standard liquidity event. This could be going public. It could be selling to another buyer. It could be a third-party initiated process. Someone comes in and says, hey, that's a nice business you've got there. I'd like to take it off your hands. Or it could be a self-initiated process where the company just feels like it's time to kind of bring new blood in and get new management, whatever. It could be that the private equity fund is winding itself down. Private equity firms invest from pools of capital. Those pools of capital tend to have time horizons on them. And if the fund is now long in the tooth, the investors who originally gave the fund the money, they typically want the money back. And so the funds will start to wind down the fund and start liquidating positions. And so it might have been a sale that they just need to do, instantiate to get the asset moved and get the funds back to their investors. And finally, they might be trying to raise a new fund. Whenever you're going out to raise capital from people, it's very helpful to have wins on the board. And having those wins comes in the form of sales. And so at some point in the past, this might have been a high-flying asset that the private equity firm was holding on to. They had the opportunity to sell it and they said, yeah, let's take it. Let's take some money off the board. So with those reasons in mind, it may make sense to revisit an asset after a period of time, 3 to 5 years. But why would they do this? That's really kind of the question you should be asking yourselves. Why on earth would they want to come back to it? Well, that could come from a variety of things. One, for sure, comfort with the management team. When they sold the asset, it didn't mean they thought it was a bad asset to hold on to. In fact, they might have loved the management team. But so in this case, when they're coming back around and the asset's still available or it becomes available again and the management team is still there, the private equity firm might be thinking to themselves, oh, well, we already know these guys. And they're sharp. They do what we ask them to do. They're great operators. They've grown the business. They're very responsible stewards of capital. So we'd like to be a part of this again. Two, the state of the company now might be more in alignment with a fund mandate that's a different fund within the larger private equity firm. So you get these smaller private equity firms, and they're kind of dealing with one fund at a time. But the really big boys, they'll have many funds that invest across multiple types of asset classes, whether it's growth equity or bankruptcy or mezzanine debt or any number of things that they might do. And so this company might have been sold out of one fund, operated and done some things, and now in the state that it's in, it becomes a viable candidate for some other fund within the larger private equity firm. The firm might be just comfortable with the space, comfortable with the industry. They know the players, they know what's going on here, and they say, yeah, this is an asset that we were interested in once. We sold it for whatever reason. It's come back around. Maybe it had some troubles in the intervening years. Now it's on the upswing and needs some fresh capital because it had some capital constraints, and we'd like to participate. And finally, it might just be an acquisition target for another company within the portfolio. So in this case, you as a private equity firm, you're managing your portfolio of companies and you might be investing for growth. And this company that you once owned 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago has now grown to a point where it becomes an interesting, or shrank to a point, quite frankly, where it becomes an interesting target for one of your other companies within your portfolio. Because most firms tend to invest by vertical industries. And so they're going to know all of the players, they're going to know all the companies, and they know how to grow their businesses and quite frankly, how to divest those assets. So what does a PE firm buying a company mean relative to the impact on the culture and the company? Well, it depends. There's multiple types of PE firms, and how they think about an asset post-acquisition will vary based on their fund strategy. If you think about a VC investor, they always want growth, right? That's generally why they're investing in a business. They put in a small amount of money and they'd like that company to grow to be a big company, and they get growth. And that more aligns with what we'll call growth equity, private equity investors. Most of the stories that you hear about private equity, the ones that are in the news most of the time, tend to be about the firms that are, well, not growth minded. They load companies up with debt. They squeeze the workforce down as far as they can. They pay themselves, we'll call them large bonuses, and ultimately are using financial engineering and other machinations to kind of get a financial return that may not necessarily be in the best interest of the company or the employees. Those can absolutely be very difficult situations to walk into as an employee. Growth equity investors tend to want to uplevel the talent pool whenever they make an investment in a new company. Not always. Sometimes the management teams are excellent and the private equity investors are backing that management team alone, and they're giving them growth capital to expand their team, but they're not necessarily looking to swap out the management team. But in a lot of cases, they tend to want to uplevel their management teams, and those are somewhat friendlier situations in which to walk. But it's an important caveat to understand that with many growth equity investments, when they're swapping out their senior leadership, this can sometimes create resentment amongst the workforce, right? So think about it. You're walking into a situation where you're going to get hired in. The new management team has come in and they've said, well, for a variety of reasons, these people are no longer needed. Maybe they're not as talented as we need them to be. They're not as productive as we need them to be. Maybe they're overpaid for what it is they're delivering. But in smaller companies, which, private equity firms, they invest across the gamut of businesses, but anything kind of less than, call it 50 million might be a bit big, 20 million or less. Those companies tend to be a bit smaller, tight-knit communities. And when someone gets let go, that can hit home pretty hard and people can be pretty upset about that kind of thing. So you might be walking into a situation where you're tied to the new management team that just fired Joe, and Joe sits over there, and now you're interviewing with me, and I liked Joe, and Joe and I had barbecues together, and my kids played baseball with Joe, and who are you? You're coming in for Joe's job? And so that's just something you got to keep in the back of your mind when you're stepping into a situation like that. So with the case of one financial firm selling to another, the management team might be left completely intact. We talked earlier about the suitability for an investment for a particular fund lifecycle, and one fund might just say, hey, it's time for us to exit this investment. This is a great management team. They're growing the business. They're killing it. We want our return on investment because we put in, $10 million. We're going to make $30 million. You're going to pay us the amount of money to buy the business. Have good luck, next PE firm owner of this with the business. We think the management team absolutely kicks ass. So thank you very much. And so that's a good situation in which to walk. But with any new owner, there's always transitions. And transitions, new money, there's always going to be that contingent of people who they don't like change. People just don't like change. Things are different. I don't like it, blah, blah, blah. And so that's always going to be a situation where in an interview situation, of course, you might hear some complaining, which it's unfortunate, but you just got to remember to take it with a grain of salt and hear with the right ear. So the question you're asking yourself is, well, I'm considering going into one of these businesses, and I'd really like to know how to ask questions about what's been going on since the acquisition to really understand what kind of an investor this is. And so one way to think about this is frame up how recent that acquisition is. Call it in the last 18 months. That would be a recent acquisition. Here's some things you might want to ask your interviewer that will give you good insight on what's going on inside the business since the acquisition has occurred, that will help you understand how the budgeting is being done, what kind of investor you've got, how supportive they've been, whether or not there's been a lot of turnover in management. There's a lot of really good information that you can glean out from just a few simple questions. So the first question you might ask might be as follows. So in my research about this company, it looks like the previous investor repurchased the business, which I guess I've never really seen that happen that often. I've only been in kind of VC-backed companies, and that doesn't really happen. So how has that changed in the equity ownership, kind of going from the previous owner to a new owner and then back to the new owner? How's it affected how you operated? You might want to ask, have you been able to maintain whatever levels of independence post the sale to now, or are you finding that the new private equity firms, because there might be more than one player in an acquisition, are able to add value, right? So in this question, you're demonstrating, one, that you've done your homework, so good for you. But you're also asking a very reasonable question, which is not framed in a way that makes the person that you're asking get defensive, right? They don't feel like they're tattling on their previous owners, which is actually a good thing. But in asking the question as a value add statement, you're positioning this as a positive predisposition, right? That you've got a growth mindset, and that's good for you as a candidate, while giving the person answering the question a viable kind of out if things are changed. They're not happy with them. It gives them a way to kind of talk about it without really feeling like they're kind of digging into the weeds or airing any of the dirty laundry, right? So they don't have to say, it's been terrible. Because they're never going to, well, they might say that, but they shouldn't say that. But they can effectively say the same thing by saying something like, yeah, they've made a lot of changes, and we've been working really hard to live up to their expectations. That's a pretty good tell that things are not where they were, or maybe the investor's not kind of in line with a growth mindset or what you might want to be stepping into when looking for a growth company. This is really code for they're squeezing us. So here's another question that you might try that'll help you better understand this sort of thing and how things have been with the new owner. So with the new investors, have you found that you've had the budget and the equity to kind of add to your team or grow the team as needed to hit your aggressive targets? All right. And so again, this question is getting at whether or not the firm that bought this company has a growth mindset, or if they're a squeeze partner, someone who wants to come in and really grind it down and get as much out of the business as they can without necessarily investing in the assets. And the nice side benefit, of course, again, is framing you as a growth mindset individual, right? Someone who's thinking about growth, you're already thinking about working there, you want to hit aggressive targets, but you're trying to understand what you're stepping into. In the case of a transaction that's happened in the last 6 to 18 months, this is a clever way at getting at a similar piece of data, but it really only works if the company's had a minimum of 2 quarters to operate since they were acquired. Here's the question. So how much has the team grown since May of 2018 until now? You see what I did there? The May of 2018 was the date of the acquisition. Don't just say May of 2018. That's the date when the new private equity partner came in. By using that date, you're demonstrating, once again, you've done your homework, so good for you. That's awesome. But by framing it as from the time of the acquisition until now, you're asking how much the team has grown. You're going to get a pretty good lens on, well, are they being asked to do too much, too little? Has the team grown or shrunk? Are people leaving or not? There's any number of things that the interviewer might say in response to that. They might even offer up a lot of information you didn't ask for, because they might offer up, well, yeah, no, gosh, it's been rough. We had to fire a bunch of people. We were completely overstaffed, it turns out, I guess, right? So that's going to tell you 2 things. 1, how does he feel about it or she feel about it, really? And 2, what kind of investor do you have? So these are just easy questions that you can ask. That give you a really good lens on what's going on with the business. Because remember, when you're asking these questions, what you're really trying to do is frame yourself as a member of the team or a future member of the team who has a growth mindset. But what you're going to learn is whether or not the team that you're going to join has the capital to grow. And if the transaction's been really recent, so kind of in that 6 months to now, right? Let's say you're interviewing and the ink is barely drying on the contract. It was done in the last month. You could ask a variant of the question as follows. So how's your budgeting process changed as a result of having this new owner? Did you guys have a complete overhaul, or is it kind of the same, right? So again, you're positioning yourself as someone who's been through budgeting, which is good. That's a good thing to have from a leadership skills standpoint. But also, you're recognizing that when new ownership or new leadership comes in, things change, and so you're trying to understand what may or may not have occurred as a result of the new people coming in. And if the transaction has occurred in the last 2 quarters, I promise you, the private equity firm has put in a new board book that they expect to see, and a new set of metrics and reporting and a whole bunch of other things that they need to see as they're managing their portfolio broadly, that they expect from this company and this management team. And so that will have been put in place, and you'll have a pretty good lens as to whether or not that's a massive change or just a small change from what the management team was already doing. So if you want to go ahead and ask a question without necessarily talking about the private equity firm, but you still want to get a sense for how have things been, a clever way to doing this is by asking, you can ask the hiring manager, whoever's interviewing you, or you can ask the recruiter. You can ask, how long have they been on the team? And what about their boss? There's a couple of key things that you'll learn from asking that question. 1, where did this person come from? Did they come as part of the management team that came in? Were they hired in after the fact? Were they part of the old guard? How are they feeling about the transaction? 2, it's going to give you a lens on whether or not their manager came in with the new guard, was already there or not, was someone that was hired after the fact, added as a layer. Maybe this person got passed over for promotion and they're upset about it. They don't like how things are being done from a staffing point of view. So that's great. It's also going to help you understand turnover. It's a clever way of getting at turnover information, right? Because if your boss or this person that you're interviewing with, who's potentially your boss, and their boss's boss, they're both new, or a peer that you're interviewing with, they're new, right? You're going to have a sense of people leaving, and they might then at that point offer up reasons why people left, especially if they're kind of not happy about it and they want to complain. Sometimes people will complain in these interviews, and that's always a good way to learn more about what's going on with business, what's going on with the new management team, and the new owners. But this is a journalism skill that I learned from a movie or something. But when you ask these questions, this one specifically, don't say anything. Just let them answer. And then they're going to say something. Still don't say anything. You got to let that pause be just uncomfortable enough that they want to fill it. And then you're going to fill it with information that's super useful or not, but give them that opportunity. Don't just jump in and start asking your next question, because you might miss out on a really, really, really valuable piece of information that might follow from what they initially answered with that would really help you in making your decision about whether or not this is a firm you want to go work for. But if you're insistent on asking a question in that pregnant pause, or maybe as a follow-on, and you're feeling particularly bold, one thing you might ask is, or say, if they talk about someone who's left, wow, I'm really sorry, was so-and-so a friend of yours? Where did they go? Why did they leave? They may answer the question, they may not, but again, it's an empathetic or empathic way for you to connect with your interviewer, but also potentially get information about, one, why the person left and what was the cause of their leaving, but two, where did they go? Right? If the person left, Joey Bag of Donuts window shop to go to Google, the person was probably pretty talented. Well, why did they leave here to go to Google as part of this new transaction? Did they see the writing on the wall? Do they feel like their opportunity was better elsewhere? Who knows? But again, more useful information from very simple questions that you can ask during your interview. So now let's get into questions you could ask to a peer, right? Because oftentimes when you're looping, you'll interview with your hiring manager, but you'll likely be interviewing with people that are peers to you, whether in your specific group or elsewhere. And so a really easy and clever way to introduce a question about what's been going on post-transaction while still framing yourself as a high-quality candidate is in a very upbeat way, go, wow, pretty exciting times with a new investor. How's that going? Right? Or if you've been a part of a transaction in the past and maybe you want to let on, say, I've been through one of these before. How's it going for you? Again, leave that pregnant pause, let them answer. But really, this should be asked, again, at a peer level, because what you want is that feeling of kinship with the person when they feel a bit more comfortable answering. Your boss is not, or your potential boss, is just not going to answer the question the same way as someone you might be working with on a more regular basis. And certainly someone down the chain you can ask, but then you're going to have to weigh the answer against, how does that measure up based on kind of what the needs of the organization are. And that tends to be one of those peer level questions. It's more effective. So another question you might ask a peer to ascertain what's been going on post-transaction is really simply, so were you here when the PE firm came in, or did you come in after? Are things kind of same with the sale, or do you have more resources, or kind of things? What's changed since the big fund came in, right? And so again, because you're asking a peer, it feels very much like you're already kind of working together. You feel comfortable. You want to have that conversation, and it feels a lot less of a kind of defensive or even a selling question, right? So if I'm your potential hiring manager, I don't want to be thinking, well, why are they asking this question? What are they worried about? That's the wrong mindset. But when you're asking a peer and you're saying, well, did you come in? Have you had the resources? You're kind of indicating, hey, I want to go someplace that's growing. I've got a growth mindset, and I'd like to hear what you're thinking. And if they're of a similar mindset, they're going to share that with you. And so if they have less resources, you're definitely going to hear about it. And the person might even complain, which generally when people complain, you got to stop that, nip it in the bud real quickly. You don't want to catch the stink of complaint as they come out of the interview. They already have a negative mindset. So just chop that wherever you can. Just say, I don't know, come up with something interesting. But things that I've said is, hey, well, what's the most exciting thing that's happened? Right? Just kind of stop it short. So what advice or guidance do I have for someone coming from a tech background into a non-tech company that's recently been acquired by a PE firm? Well, it's really going to depend. Sometimes you can step into a really great situation where the new management team and the new investors are trying to grow the business. They're investing for growth. They want to bring in some of that, call it Silicon Valley pixie dust, and sprinkle it on their company and really ramp things up. And that's awesome. But just understand that you might be stepping into a recruiting challenge, getting people to come to a non-tech company. To some people might feel like it's a step off the merry-go-round that they're kind of on in Silicon Valley, where they're kind of up-leveling as they go. And they might not see this as a stepping stone and as an advancement in their career. To that, I would say most of these opportunities, you're going to get more work and more role diversity than you probably would get in some of the other companies in Silicon Valley, because you're going to be able to do so much and bring so much new to the table that generally the management team is going to let you kind of go if, again, they have the growth mindset and they're investing for growth. And so it could be a great opportunity to slingshot yourself into a much more advanced role with far more experience and more exposure within the organization and potentially even to the industry than you might have had if you stayed where you were at. But, it's an important but, sometimes a change can be slow. You might be stepping into a situation where they want to invest for growth, but invest for growth for them is not really what you've become accustomed to. And so things are going to take a little bit longer and things are going a little bit slower, or maybe they move at a different pace and they're not used to the kind of fire in your belly, moving with impetus kind of pace, the relentless pace that sometimes some of these tech firms can move at. And that can be a bit off-putting for people when you step into that organization and they've just been operating at one pace and you're just at a different, faster pace. And so you're going to have to adjust as you go and learn how to kind of get along before you go along. But once you figure that out, there really is nothing but upside, right? Because if you think about all the skills that you're bringing to the table, we're starting to see more people now willing to look outside of the typical tech strongholds because of work from home and the ability to work remote. They're going to move to locations where, you know what, it doesn't matter where I work, so I can work at any number of companies now and maybe get a higher quality of life, work on some really cool projects, have the budgeting and the backing behind me, maybe work at a smaller company where politics are less of an issue and really have a lot of impact. And so that's really just a great opportunity for you if you find the right one. And typically when there's a private equity growth equity investor involved, there's going to be a lot of upside and a lot of opportunity to really do some great work, and it really could be valuable for your career. So hopefully that answers your questions about whether or not it makes sense for you to go to work for a company that's recently been acquired by a private equity firm. And hopefully I've given you some questions that you can ask during your interview to suss out what kind of private equity firm it is, whether they operate with a growth mindset or they're definitely trying to squeeze the company and maybe it's not such a great place for you to go after all. If you like this kind of content, please let me know by subscribing below, but certainly ask your questions in the comments below. I'm going to try to use my Thursday posts for answering these types of questions and less focus on the interviews themselves so that you can have questions that you can ask in your interview post your audition for whatever role it is you're asking, so you can learn smart things about the company, learn from their employees, learn the things you need to know, but asking in a way that positions you very, very well and stand out from the other candidates looking for the same job.